Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from coffee for those in the room, and welcome back online. Next session is going to be with, really some fantastic people on the topic of model validation. So you saw the question, or most of you will have seen the question that we posed earlier on about what's deficient in model validation. I was a bit surprised, actually, about some of the answers, but they are what they are. I'd like to suggest that maybe there are a number of issues that we face on model validation before hearing from our esteemed panel, and we're going to get some short introductions from all of them. But so first of all, why is it so hard to go through the process of model validation? I mean, it just strikes me as being so inefficient, right? I mean, if, these firms that we've all heard about all day, all fantastic companies, they have gone through weeks, months of processes of working out the assumptions they're going to make and why it makes sense. And most of the ones I talk to are very happy to make that stuff available. And surely I would like to suggest we should have some sort of standardized formats about how this is available, so that when you, the users, who clearly, both by any definition I would suggest of best practice, would want to do it for your own use, you'd also want to do it, and there are regulatory and rating agency drivers too behind this. I think we've got some issues, as somebody asked me yesterday, about do we think the regulators are sufficiently well equipped to be able to do this process? Don't want to spoil the answer, but yes, they're not well equipped to be able to do it. And I've said to people before that actually we probably need to go through a process of helping them understand what they should be doing in this thing, and of course, again, some standardization. I think another thing that I've always found interesting in this space is why does every single company, more or less, have to find data sets that are fundamental to the validation of models? Why don't we just share them? Right? Why, if we decide that we need some commercial vulnerability data sets to be able to understand the value of some model, we should have some data that we all collect or have collected, or we procure, or some academic provides us with, that we can all use, and maybe to share the cost of doing that, rather than everybody spending hours and weeks and days, whatever, trying to find this data, which in that particular example, I think is very hard to come by. So, and there are other things, but those are a couple of things that I found odd. And Oasis is interested in how we can act as a catalyst to try and help some of these problems. And as somebody has already come up to me in the break and said, we would like to help with this process because we believe it is inefficient. And at the end of all of this, if I forget, if anybody else would like to join that initiative, please let me or one of my colleagues know, and we'll see what we can. So we've got 4 really good people today, as you can see, and they're each going to have a little, well, they're each going to have a little sort of talk about what they think is an issue. And we're going to start with Nigel, Nigel Winspear, who is head of research at Sompo. And when we had a sort of pre-call, we did actually think that actually some definitional issues sort of stood out. It's like, what do we mean by evaluation or validation or even verification? And so Nigel's going to kick off, and then we're going to sort of move around here, and then we'll do lots of questions, and we're going to have a very constructive and but challenging. We're going to be challenging each other and you, more to the point. So Nigel, if you can hear us, we'd love to hear your bit of presentation.
Yes, good afternoon, Zurich. So this is Nigel Winspear, calling from London. Apologies, I can't be with you. I'm going to share the benefits of my experience in model validation. I've specialized in model validation globally, but in the last 5 years or so, I've been focused on major model change in the London market, focused on the US, but I have validated models across the world before. I'm really going to talk about, what and how do I think we should do it. And I must stress there is no single way of doing this. This is very much my preferred benefit. I'm actually going to share this benefit with you, and take what you will from this, and hopefully this will stimulate further discussion. So next slide, please. So I'm going to break down the definition of model validation. I'm going to really break it down into two core questions. I'm going to emphasize that we need to address both of those in degree of effort that is tailored to match the materiality of the peril. And of course, we would also need to design the content of our validation in advance. So it's really like a structured approach to model validation. And finally, I'm highlighting two items, and I can think of at least four that model validation is often confused with, and I would flag that it's here what I think it's not. Okay, it's really important to remember this. Next slide, please. So the definition of model validation, now this comes from the Lloyd's Market Association, 2012. It's actually from Phil Holt's presentation. It's the process by which you determine whether the external model provides a valid representation of a cat risk posed to your portfolio. Right, so very good. I fully agree with that. It's, you know, but what does it actually mean? Well, when you start taking this apart, certainly from my perspective, this boils down to two core questions, right? So model validation, in my mind, is addressed by these two questions. The first of which is, does the model represent the system that you're trying to model, right? So if you're building a hurricane model, how well does it fit the data and the system to which it's being represented? That says nothing at all about how good it is with your portfolio. All it says is that it's a reasonable fit, for example, against HERDAT or against an industry portfolio. It says nothing at all really against my own particular portfolio. So the second question is, how well does it predict? You know, you build models to make predictions, right? In terms of data that have not been used to build the model. So how well does it predict using unrelated or independent data that hasn't been used to build it? And that's basically our portfolios, right? So how does it look on that? Basically, these two questions are boiling down, is the model any good? Right? So in my view, model validation at this theoretical level should be designed to answer both questions. And we should tailor our effort to reflect the materiality of a peril. Next slide, please. So in terms of materiality, how do we assess this? I mean, there is no hard and fast way. And actually, I've worked for companies as a consultant where I can honestly say that it's quite common to not have any strict definition of what is, in terms of materiality definitions, materiality ranking. Here is an example, though. You can either base it on the OEP, say, for example, 1 in 100, or percentage of GWP, or one or both, or other metrics. And then at some point, you're going to need to break that down into a materiality ranking, high, medium, low, immaterial in this case. You could, at that point, just map your validation report category to the materiality category. You could have a highly important validation. I prefer to call it comprehensive, simply because I don't like to have an immaterial validation. I like to have a light touch validation. But you can see the questions that I'm seeking to address in those tailored approaches. So light touch would be question 1 only, just looking at the fit of the model to the system. Basic to comprehensive are looking to address both of those questions. In the ideal world, we would place equal emphasis on answering both of those questions. And of course, I've seen all manner of different emphases placed on answering question 1 and question 2, ranging from 0 to significant. So the risk is that we have imbalance between answering those two questions. And if we sign off and use our model without knowing if it's a good fit to the peril, it means we haven't spent enough time on question 1. And there's also a risk that we could use the model for portfolios for which it's not well calibrated, which is question 2, right? So if we do that, then we have a risk of improper risk assessment. An example of portfolios for which the model may not be well calibrated, I'm thinking off the top of my head, large commercial line risks in the United States for earthquake and hurricane. Next slide, please.
Nigel, just so you know, time is moving faster than you think.
Oh, okay. I will skip over this slide in this case. This is an example of the content. So please look at that at your leisure. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. What I think it's not the development of an own view of risk. An own view of risk is basically, it should basically flow from the validation exercise. The validation lays the foundation for it. And it's not functional verification either. So when we start the validation, we assume the model works as intended. Not always the case, especially on new platform releases as well. Okay, so with that in mind, I think that's my last slide. I'll hand back to the panel. Thank you.
Nigel, that's great. Thank you very much. So a little bit of a quick overview there, but that's okay. We can come back and challenge Nigel maybe on some of those things. Oriol is now going to give a little bit of perspective as he runs analytics in London for Aon. And you see a lot of activities from your clients. And we'd love to know what you think about how this all works from your perspective.
I shall do my best. So I think I've had the privilege in my career to be across many areas. So I started as a model developer, then I went to a model evaluation team, and then I've been leading Japan Analytics for 5 years and now in the UK. So I see different degrees. And while in principle, I agree with everything that Nigel said, in practicality, I'm afraid I'll have to disagree. This is just an example of what a large insurance company will ask us to do internal evaluation, what they might do internally. At the end of the day, as a reinsurance broker, that's what I have to do. I have to place a view of risk. So yes, the model evaluation or evaluation underpins that view of risk. Now, the main problem that I face, or that as a broker we face, is this, right? What does model validation mean to the individual players? Right, so on the top, you have the type of clients that we normally deal, a large global, a super regional, the retrocession, so there's a reinsurer who places. All these people at the same time, they also receive that view of risk. So the validation could mean something very different to each of them. And I'll give a couple examples of recent ones, right? So most recent, RMS released the new hurricane model. The validation in general terms is, what does it mean for me in my portfolio? How it compares to previous years? Can you explain me the changes? Can I use it for this renewal? Yes or no. The model validation is not a one, an OEP or a number. Is a yes. Oriol or Aon, please give me a yes or no answer, and why not? For another company, a domestic company, model validation can be something very similar to what Nigel mentioned, because they have to fill some solvency or regulatory requirements. Therefore, you would go to a similar process to Nigel. So I want to say, in a nutshell, why I love definitions and standards. I think we ought to be flexible for the benefit of the market. I'm suffering on a daily basis reality checks of what is my team doing regarding evaluation, validation, model building, and what the market needs. And there's a big gap within Aon, or what a broker thinks a model validation is versus what I think. And that brings me a lot of problems. And I would love some standards there, right? And I think they're necessary. But how you get there, I think we're all going to have very different perspectives.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that's a good controversial second point. I'm dying to ask a couple of questions, but we're going to hold back for a second. And you can start asking them online if you wish, but we are going to hold because we're now going to get Guido, who's going to give us a large global perspective. And let's see where that puts you in between the two slightly different perspectives we've had so far.
Thank you. I missed the all of the above option in the previous slide, because for us, I can tell you what the model validation means in our context for a large primary insurer. I briefly sketched here the kind of the main criteria in the center of this slide that we have for model validation. There are quite a few points to consider, as you see. The ones on the bottom part are more related to the business perspective, and that's something that's probably very difficult to standardize, and that's probably also one issue that you see from your side. On the other hand side, we have in the upper part the more criteria that are more related to the scientific perspective. And there, I think there is a lot more that can be done in terms of standardization and transparency, because all the underlying publications are accessible. We have so many open data sets, and it's getting more every single day. We have emerging tools and methods that we want to use and that we can actually use and to leverage our tools and to provide more insights. And on this side, on the scientific perspective, I think there is much that can be done in terms of standardization. I can just give you a brief example. I just randomly picked one simple question that we usually have during a model validation process. And that's the simple question: does the hazard component reflect the current conditions? Because already here the controversial discussion starts. Should it reflect current conditions? Should we on-level it to current conditions to consider trends? There are many different processes that are considered in some hazard modules, are not considered in others. And there's just no standardization at all on the hazard component. What does this mean for us? Well, we want to have global consistency and consistency across different models and perils. So we need to ask these questions, and we need to understand what's behind the stochastic event set that's typically used in a model. So we need to get in touch with the modelers, use their time, because those are typically questions that cannot be really answered by the first level support. We then have to assess whether we should take actions or not, if we should correct the model into a certain direction to actually reach this desired standardization and global consistency. And this is just a lot of work around the hazard component, and it could be simplified a lot by just having a set of standardized questions and answers for each specific model. It can be as simple as a single spreadsheet with some basic information for every model. In this case, does the hazard module reflect the current conditions? What has been done to ensure it reflects current conditions? And if not, what period has been used for calibrating the model? Because we can deal with that. We can deal with imperfect model and with assumptions, but we just need to have this information. We just need transparency on the single components of each model. And then,
can I just ask you just to check, so the responsibility of that comes from the model provider, right?
Well,
in your
we need to know what's behind the model in the end. We don't really like black box models anymore. There was a time a few years back when we just were happy with the available models, and there were many scientists behind the scene working on this hazard component. Model provider said, yeah, sure, be confident the model that the hazard component is fine, and we were trusting this information, and we can't do that anymore. We want to really understand all the single components and to make sure we are actually happy with this model and it's fit for purpose and fit for our needs.
So is it the model provider? Because you can't expect model A to know what model B, how to express things, right? So one thing is the framework, the standard. The other thing is the information in there.
Let me get to the next slide.
Okay, sorry.
Starts. Well, it's maybe some input for further thoughts, and might also trigger one or the other discussion in the audience. So I'm aware that there are different perspectives, and the insurer perspective is not the same as the model provider perspective. From an insurer perspective, we will keep doing this validation, and it's a very crucial point for us, and we need transparency for actually doing this validation. On the same time, I'm asking for sharing data and for transparency. At the same time, we are not really allowed to share much of our data sets due to legal restrictions. And I think that one industry standard, at least for technical documentations and validation reports, would help a lot and just reduce the non-value adding workload, at least on our side. But there's a model provider view. There are some IP considerations, of course. There's typically not a big motivation for transparency around limitations and model deficiencies. We know they exist. We can deal with model deficiencies. We just need to know what's going on with this model to actually being able to deal with that. But combining both perspectives, I still see quite a few opportunities for industry collaborations. I listed some of them here, and I'm sure there are many more ideas here in the panel or in the audience on how these things could be simplified and standardized.
Excellent. Right. So before we get some questions, we have one last speaker. Do you want to move on one slide? Because I think you don't. Have you got a slide? I can't remember now. Oh, you have one.
I need to stand up because we're at the sleepy end of the afternoon and get the oxygen flowing. Thank you very much to the organisers for the chance to participate in my favourite modelling conference. I've probably spent half my time as a model builder and half the time as a validator of other people's models. So it's natural for me to want to explore the relationship between the two, and particularly around this question that we're addressing now of who should be doing what. And I'm very much one who thinks in terms of specifics. So I'm just going to use an example, taking a data set from the literature. This is not a cat model event set. It's a stochastic open data set for US or for North Atlantic tropical cyclone risk. It's not intended to be used for this purpose. I'm simply using it as a toy data set to examine what I do as a model validator and how that impacts how I view the statistics or the validation that's provided in the paper. So this paper has some various validation statistics. It's by no means passing judgment on this data set. It is a very well documented open data set, and my utmost respect to the authors of this paper for producing this data set. And so what can we learn from this data set in terms of validation? The figure on the left is what's in the paper in terms of validation. Many different statistics of the tracks showing how it compares over, it's a global data set over each basin, and shows it validates very well across all these measures within the measure of uncertainty as portrayed in the paper. But then the user of the data set, which is, okay, I've just taken this as a simple parametric index. I've put a polygon around Florida, just based on the convex hull around a certain radius, and I've just looked at the maximum wind speed from each storm within that polygon. If you take the historical data set, the exact historical data set on which the stochastic data set is built, you get the black curve, the black EP curve, maximum wind speed in knots on the y-axis versus return period on the on the x-axis. And you do the same for the stochastic event set and you get the blue curve. You say, okay, they're very different, and you'd be a bit alarmed if you saw this in a cat model. We can do some more statistical tests to see, are they statistically different? So we pull out samples from the stochastic event set of the same length as history, and we can build up those confidence intervals, which I show in the dashed interval. And it shows that overall, the historic event set is very unlikely to be reproduced from the stochastic event set. They are statistically very different. These confidence intervals just show the 5th to 95th percentile. There's actually less than a 1% chance that you would have seen history were the climatology based on the stochastic event set. For those who are more technically curious, I don't think I'm the only one in the room who shares that. We can look further and say, okay, why is that the case? And this is the sort of things we do as model validators. We need to go this extra step to really understand the stochastic event set. So here I'm showing activity in the form of a 3-dimensional kernel density estimate. It sounds complicated, but you just think about it as a surface, just a solid, the 3 dimensions, a latitude, longitude, and wind speed. And each point inside that surface could be measured by a temperature and a density, and it just represents the activity of tropical cyclone risk at that particular latitude, longitude, and wind speed. On the left, we have history, and on the right, we have the stochastic event set. And overall, they look the same, but then you start digging into the details. Why is there such a different risk over Florida? And you can see, well, actually, the whole Gulf is very low in risk compared in the stochastic event set to history. And we can do statistical tests on these, and we show that overall, those two are very, very different statistically. So what can we learn from this? I think it shows that this is an extreme example, but I've performed many similar such cases or studies on vendor models. And the take home I have is that at the moment, let's just consider the model structure in terms of from the event through the local hazard, through the hazard and exposure locations and the vulnerability and the risk, the typical flow of data from a CAT model. And I'd say as model developers, we have more access to information on the left, and as the user, we have more information on the right-hand side. And developers obviously need to make sure their CAT model is fit for purpose. And we as developers partner with clients to make sure we can do as much on the right-hand side of the validation. But what I challenge is, does the user need to be doing all that too? Can we work out ways that the user doesn't have to validate every part of the model? Yes, they need to own their view of risk. They need to understand the model, but do they have to do all these analyses themselves? And that's really the question I'd address here. So the final slide is, how do we get there? And I think what we've discussed now is the way forward. We need to make sure there are clear guidelines about what a model provider does provide to users, to give them the confidence without them having to go and do all that themselves. So I've listed various things there, but I think these have all come up from my previous colleagues on the stage and from what we're going to continue with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That's fantastic. Okay, we're going to come to questions from everybody in just a second, but I think we should give Nigel one chance to come back here, because I am personally slightly struggling with the suggestion that actually there's a difference, Oriol, between what you were saying and what he was saying. I don't think I saw that, but maybe I'm happy to be wrong. But Nigel, what do you think?
I don't think there's a difference per se. I pointed out that my light touch, I'm addressing question 1: is the model any good in terms of representing the system? Everything above that question and basic to comprehensive validation approaches that I'm proposing addresses the user perspective, the question 2 perspective. Is the model any good on my portfolio perspective? Right? And that's basically, as far as I can tell, that's Oriol's job, right? The question 2. Right? For those who have to submit to regulators as well, they need to involve question 1 as well, right? So it really does depend in part on your target audience. Oriol's target audience is the market. My target audience tends to be regulators and internal business stakeholders. Yeah. Does that harmonize?
So, I mean,
yeah.
So to me, sort of makes sense, right? You're getting a component of the question, or you could be getting the last element of the question. I don't think I'm happy to have disagreement here, but I don't think that what your clients are asking you necessarily means that what Nigel said isn't true. It's just that they're asking you a short form perspective on this validation issue. Is that?
Yeah, that's probably fair. I think the problem I face is the short form ignores so much. So nothing of what Marco mentioned, and until really down in the conversation for specific client perspective, that's when you go into those components. So it's kind of the perspective of the user, and I completely agree. I'm just trying to be a bit more controversial than necessary, because I don't want people to fall asleep. But there is that there is a modelation framework that help us all at the same time. I say probably not, although the underlying components are probably the same.
Yeah. Okay. So, because I think that's good. Okay, that's fine. Because we like this, we like some disagreement, but I think we want to have disagreement on the sensible things, right? And I think that there's some similarity, but I think you do potentially highlight one problem. And I've seen this myself, and I'm sure there's lots of people in this audience who say, well, not in my company. But I have seen too often a situation where, say, an underwriter, and the underwriters, of course, might be the end user potentially for your questions, or it could be other people, it could be, will say things like, if this model produces results that are more than 15% from what I was using last year, and if that 15% is going to make it more difficult to achieve targets on income, profitability, and everything else, then I don't like it, right? Now, of course, to which the answer is, well, you may not like it. That doesn't mean, it's like that's just reality in some cases. Nigel, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I would say that position, I think, is absolutely valid, based on their experience, because typically it's based on the expected loss expectation. And of course, the view of risk, that's superimposing a view of risk at the very short end of the EP curve, typically, on top of the validation. So it doesn't, from my perspective, it doesn't undermine the validation. The validation could show that it's a good fit to the hurricane system, could show that it's a good fit to the industry portfolio, could show that it's a good fit for some of our company portfolios, but not others, not their particular one. UK flood in particular, I'm thinking of at the moment, right? You know, that's a contentious one in the UK in terms of pricing. We've struggled with 5 models so far in order to, there's such a variation between them, and the underwriter has exactly the situation in which you've discussed. Right. So yeah, on top of that, the answer from my perspective would be, well, you pick your model and you define your view of risk and you superimpose that on the model. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's one thing, and then I think the other question that maybe we're not so far away on, at least from I've heard, is the role of model vendors in supporting the analysis that the validation and part of that validation analysis. And I think, Guido, you were saying that would be helpful, right?
Yes, I'm not sure if I fully agree with Malcolm. Well, I appreciate that you want to reduce our effort for model validation, but I think the question is just too important for us. For the whole organization, that we cannot delegate or outsource that. Yeah, it flows into underwriting decisions, into capital modeling, into pricing. So we just have to be confident, and we cannot delegate this work. Well, on top of that, we have also a responsibility towards customers, towards shareholders, towards regulators. It's just too important. So that's the reason why I mainly ask for more transparency, not for more or longer validation reports. Or, as I said, also for maybe standardized skill scores on model results and model performance. So I think this part would already help a lot. But we will keep doing this model validation for sure.
Just a response to that. So the point I'm making is not that, definitely not that validation documents are longer. What I propose is that there should be diagnostics that you request that we give you as developers. So do you need to run a fine gridded exposure in order to, with artificial exposure, in order to extract the hazard map, for instance, which we often do. We have a third-party hazard map for a particular peril. We go and run a detailed gridded exposure, we extract the hazard map, and that's quite time-consuming. Do you need to do that yourself, or should you be able to request the hazard maps from the model vendor, just for one example? Or do you think you have to be able to do that yourself, extract the hazard map and reconstruct it yourself in order to gain confidence in the model?
Yeah, I think in that case, I very much agree. We just call the same thing a bit differently. I think that's from my perspective, and actually we have done these exercises with re-engineering.
Oh, everyone has. The question is, do we all need to do the same
but
thing?
that's for me part of the transparency I mentioned. So providers should be transparent enough and just provide this information. We will figure it out anyway, and if not, we are not confident with the model, so there's no way around that.
Yeah.
And presumably there is there's a hierarchy of use cases, maybe is the right way to describe this, of validation types, because a Zurich can afford to have significant resources and expertise that can be focused on the validation, and for maybe other reasons too, but there's a lot of people there. A very small company might go to their broker to be able to get a similar type of service. So actually, one of the advantages, in a way, you could argue that one of the advantages about the brokers is they do some of this validation once on a model from a vendor for a region, and then when they get 20 questions from clients, they can actually create efficiency by answering that question from that one analysis they've done on whatever it happens to be that they're doing. I mean, that's quite an efficient way of doing that for the smaller organizations that don't have the internal resources that a Zurich would have. So I think and then of course, but of course, in a way, you could argue that some of the work that might be done by, for a broker, could be done by the model developer, because again, that's being more efficient. But we all, I think, would agree, and I don't know if you would agree with this too, Malcolm, but we'd all agree that you can't rely on everything coming from the model provider itself. I mean, you're a trustworthy sort of person, but you need to go through this process yourself. And I think you'd learn something by going through some of this. Is there a danger that actually we just feed everybody with all the right answers and then never think about the damn models in the first place?
Well, I think it's clear the user of the model has to take responsibility for the validation. It's their validation, it's their internal validation. It's just that it's natural that the model builder has much more ready access to the data that they need without them having to reverse engineer or extract that data. I suppose what I'm really trying to encourage or to help, Nigel presented this hierarchy of validation efforts depending on the materiality of the peril zone. Yes, it's clear you want to spend more time on your peak zones, but how do we elevate those zones or the quality of validation for which you can only assign a small amount of resources? How do we elevate the quality of that validation to a higher level with just the same amount of effort?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to come to the audience in literally a couple of seconds, and then we'll do the online stuff. But I suppose the other issue I've always been concerned with is I have observed, I think, too often organizations that go, we've done some analysis of Model X, right? And when I say some analysis, I really mean some analysis, not much. And then they go, as a result of that, we don't agree with the assumptions they made, and therefore we've changed the frequencies a bit of these models. I think one of the things that if one needs some assistance here, think about the conversation we just had on flood. How many organizations have the ability to make a judgment about how model A, B, or C is looking at how culverts are done, about how some other aspects are done? Is very, very technical. And I think that it's, you've got to make the assumption there's not many people that can do that analysis. So some of the validation, maybe I'm coming back to your point, that would be a spurious validation potentially, because they don't know, and only you know, or modelers like you know. Does that make sense?
I mean, of course, the users have their own expertise, but I think one thing that when users do the validation themselves, it does encourage dialogue between the two parties, and that's what we're really trying to get at, is to make that communication more productive.
Yeah.
And so you can address exactly those key questions which matter. And therefore, the problem is, how do we go straight to those important topics that are most relevant for the validation and not skirt around the edges on the smaller topics?
Good point. Now, sorry, Oriol, please.
I think it's part of the game, right? So it'd be like Brexit. You say something and you spend... I have to bring it in. I had to bring it in. You say something and then the competition spends hours trying to figure out whether that's true or not. It's part of the game. You can't, I mean...
That's the most depressing thing I've heard all day. Fucking Brexit. Okay, but okay, that's sort of hard to. Well, I like the idea of a game, right? I think there is a bit of a game. I think we should be acknowledge the fact that there are,
It's more about how efficient you are on covering those bases, right? So a new model comes out. If you're the first one with an opinion out, people are going to listen to you, right? And yeah, you might throw some curveballs there. So are you ready to answer to those curveballs or not? I think that, to me, at the end of the day, and bear in mind, I come from a reinsurance broker, but I have to handle with the retrocession world, which is a very shallow world in terms of how much they can accept on technical information.